Okay, so in the last chapter, um, the men were gathering in the common area, like the park. They called it the what they call it, the common area, and they were reading the Declaration. And they were standing near the statue of King George astride his horse. And Isabel was just saying how huge it was. Ropes appeared as if conjured, thick ropes used for tying ships to the docks. The men cheered louder and worked together to throw the ropes over the king's statue and his horse and tie them tightly. 1, 2, 3, heave! 1, 2, 3, heave! Heave means pull. The men strained their arms and backs. Boys on the edge of the crowd jumped up and down. Common folk stood froze at the sight of a king being pulled down by the strength of the men working together. 1, 2, 3, heave! The statue toppled, slowly at first, then gaining speed as a weight fell from the sky to the ground. The men scrambled out of the way, no one wishing to be crushed by a fallen king. As it crashed, they shouted even louder and swarmed over the thing. Axes were called for and rushed out of workshops and up from the barracks. A half-dozen men took to chopping the king and his horse to bits. I inched closer. How could they be chopping through a statue with simple axes? A piece of tail broke off, and a soldier held it up for all to see. The king was not made of gold, but of soft lead, covered with a gilt paint. The crowd shouted again as another shoulder lifted the king's head, freshly removed from his neck. A fife and drum corps started playing just beyond the mob, piping out the song usually heard during a tar and feathering party. The men made short work of King George. When the statue was reduced into pieces that could be easily carted off, they did just that. The plan was to melt down all the lead into bullets. Ooh, very smart. "We'll fire Majesty at the redcoats," joked a man with a booming voice. "Aye," said his companion, shouldering an axe. Emanations from leaden George will make deep impressions on the enemy." So they're going to melt the material that they made the statue out of, and they're going to use it for bullets and for cannons and ammunition. And then since it's King George, it's kind of ironic that they're going to be using the material from King George's statue to fire at the king's army, the king's men. So that's kind of funny. As the crowd marched off to make bullets and celebrate liberty and independence in the taverns, I realized dark was fast falling, and I had tarried overly long. I picked up a sliver of lead that lay in the street. It was fringed with gilt, my own piece of majesty. "Tyrants, beware," I thought, as I put it in my pocket. So she took a little piece of that statue. It's in her pocket. I was surprised to see the front parlor windows alight when I walked down Wall Street. "Is the master back?" I asked Becky. She was dozing in the chair by the kitchen fire, with a red checkered shawl around her shoulders, still worn down from her illness. Becky yawned and stretched. "Far from it. Madam paid a call on the Reverend's wife after supper. Come home with high color in her cheeks and a bee in her bonnet. 'Dress the child,' she says. 'Make sure both of the girls eat something nourishing and sweet.'" Uh-oh, wonder what she's up to. "Did she fall and hit her head?" I asked, setting down the basket of eggs. Becky laughed. "I think the Mrs. Reverend served her a dose of scripture, the hard kind. Madam says, 'I've been too harsh on my servants. I must mend my ways or the Lord will punish me.'" I was confuddled. She's being kind to Ruth again? Becky stood slowly, wincing from the aches in her bones. "Surely so. Ruth lit up like a lantern when she saw them fancy clothes again. Promised to be quiet as ever. Made short work of the gingerbread Madam baked, too." This was too much. I sat down at the table. "Madam baked gingerbread?" "She's a fair hand in the kitchen, when she puts her mind to it," said Becky. "Left the dishes for yours truly, but the cake was tasty. Those two pieces are for you. She was most firm about that." She stopped to cough up what sounded like a large wet worm in her throat. She cooked up sweet milk for you, too, with nutmeg, cinnamon, and sugar. Said you was to have some with your gingerbread. I sniffed the pitcher. It smelled good enough. Did she have any of this? Not with this cough. Oh, no, did you have any of this? She asked Becky. Oh, not with this cough. Milk would stop at my lungs. It would stop up my lungs. I looked around the kitchen. Where's Ruth now? Becky unpinned her apron and folded it and then tied on her bonnet, preparing to go home. Madam got it in her head to play cards this evening. She has 2 companions in with her, the Mrs. Drinkwater and her daughter, the one who's to marry some sort of lord or duke or some such. Ruth is in with them. She was right cheered after the cake and the milk. Should I take anything in? I just come from there. Madam was most definite. Tell Sal, that's what they call Isabel, tell Sal to enjoy her cake and a night off. She has worked hard these weeks and could do with a good night's sleep. She called me Sal instead of girl, I asked. And you are full certain that she didn't hit her head today? Becky laughed, and the laugh caught in her throat and bubbled into a cough. Look here, she's likely to turn back into a sour old cow by breakfast. So I say, have a good sit down and enjoy a little peace. I poured a mug of the milk. Huzzah for the Reverend's wife! I wanted to savor the gingerbread bite by bite and sip the milk slowly, but I couldn't help myself. The mug was drained and the plate empty soon after Becky left. The milk was the sweetest thing I'd ever tasted. The spices so thick I could near chew them. No wonder Ruth was cheered by it. I washed up my dishes, tidied the kitchen, and found myself with idle hands. A rare event. A rare event indeed. I could sneak into the library and borrow that Crusoe book. I could read by the fire with the mending basket nearby to slip the book into should Madam approach. That seemed a fine plan. But first I wanted to shed my bodice. Bodice is like her shirt, the top part of her dress. It pinched something awful under my arms. I felt my way down the cellar stairs with my toes and heard the sound of laughter from Madam's company. I yawned. When would they leave, and what sort of ladies came to call this late? I removed my bodice and hung it on the nail. The pallet looked soothing and cool, and the thought of climbing the stairs again made me weary. But I would like to read a few more pages. But I was overly fatigued. But Mr. Crusoe was facing all sorts of dangers. But in betwixt one thought and the next, and then I fell asleep. For that, I shall never forgive myself. Uh-oh. She fell asleep. Why isn't she forgiving herself for falling asleep? I wonder if something happened. Stay tuned. There's a clue.